The motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is for some I'm sure it will seem quite unbelievable that we can be here again, and I do want to emphasise that we are here again dealing with a similar matter that we have dealt with before. I will go through the history of the police oath in a moment, but I just want to say that as much as the Minister, and indeed less so actually the Minister, much more so Jerry Brownlee, tried to express his faux grumpiness at the police for this situation we find ourselves in, I have to say the way he's conducted himself in the House this afternoon procedurally means that most people are actually probably more inclined to think that it's been incompetence on that side of the House that may actually have led us to this place today. We can only assume that this is indicative to a certain degree of a minister that has taken her eye off the ball. I mean, we all know about the concept and importance of constabulary independence, but that certainly shouldn't mean distancing yourself so far from your role as Minister of Police that not even your constables are being sworn in properly. That is how far constabulary independence has gone today, Mr. Speaker. For the sake of those listening today, though, I want to go back over how we have come to the point where we are now going through urgency in order to rectify an error in the way that the law has been administered and constables have received their ability to do their duties through the Police Act. So let's go back to the background. Now, the Policing Act in 2008, which was indeed passed under Labor, was a culmination of an incredibly large amount of work. It was conducted in a cross-party way because, of course, matters like the way that the police are governed, it's only right that we get bipartisan support on an issue like that. It took roughly 2 years of consultation before that bill came to the House. Now, before the 2008 Act, the Police Act of 1958 set out how a constable's oath was undertaken. That was set out in Section 37 of the Policing Act 1958. Now, the old law was more liberal in the way that a constables would confer their power. There was no specific authorisation required in order to confer an oath. It could be carried out by any commissioned officer. So that was Section 57 of the Policing Act 1958, quite liberal in the way that it set out those oaths. The Policing Act 2008 was quite different. Now, I want to refer to Section 22 of the Policing Act 2008, which says a police employee may become a constable only by taking the constable's oath in either of the following forms: before the Commissioner or a person authorised by the Commissioner to administer the constable's oath. So that was the change that was made in 2008. It was recognised, however, in October of 2009 that act was not being appropriately administered. And that was essentially because people who weren't correctly authorised had continued to act in the way that they had under the old law. So that meant we had an amendment made through the Policing Constables Oaths Validation Amendment Act, which meant that for the period of 1 October 2008 to 12 October 2009, everyone who was conferred an oath over that period was retrospectively covered and validated. So, Mr. Speaker, that brings us up to date with today. That is the history of the saga thus far. At some point, it has been brought to the Minister's attention, however, that amendment even then wasn't being appropriately applied. I wouldn't mind knowing from the Minister, when she rises to her feet to make another contribution to the House, at what point she became aware of this. But I also wouldn't mind hearing from the Minister or from her colleague, who indeed, the Minister in charge at the time, I believe, Judith Collins, in October 2009, it was her job to ensure that this amendment was then implemented appropriately across the New Zealand Police. Be under no doubt it was the Minister's job to make sure then that this was then carried out appropriately. But what happened instead, Mr. Speaker? Well, we now know that although that was being done appropriately within the police college situation, there were 63 ex-constables who have rejoined the police since the 13th of October 2009 who were administered their oath by a person not authorised to administer the oath. Now, how did that happen? Well, it used to be in the old days, Mr. Speaker, that a superintendent or an area controller could administer the oath locally to someone who was coming back into the police, because of course they weren't coming back through police college. That was how the old Act allowed that to happen. Of course, as I've already outlined, Mr. Speaker, in fact, if we go to section 22 of the Police Act, it very clearly states that before a commissioner or a person authorised by a police employee may become a constable only by taking the constable's oath in either the following forms before the commissioner, really clear, that's set out in primary legislation, nothing more required, or a person authorised by the commissioner. So what happened? They didn't authorise district commanders in order for them to carry out those oaths locally for ex-police officers who returned. It was pretty explicit, though, Mr. Speaker, that that's exactly what needed to happen according to the Act. The one thing that needed to happen, the minister needed to ensure was happening, was that it was either the commissioner carrying out the oaths or it was someone authorised by the commissioner. Pretty straightforward. Why didn't the minister ask who had been authorised to carry out those oaths? Why did the minister not make the checks and balances to ensure that if they weren't happening through police college, that it was at least ensuring that those who were happening outside of police college were authorised? A very basic thing that the minister surely, after reaching a situation where we had to go through urgency, surely a minister who had her eye on the ball with what was going on within the police would have asked that very question. So that is a significant concern for the Labour Party. I would like to hear from the minister why those checks and balances weren't in place. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear. It would be irresponsible of this side of the House, in fact, it would be irresponsible of any party in this House not to support this legislation. We need to ensure that those officers, those 63 officers, in the performance of their duties have their role validated retrospectively. We have serious qualms about any time that retrospective legislation is used, but if you're going to use an example of where it's something that just has to be accepted, this would be one of them. It would be irresponsible to take any other position. But I think it's only fair and right that we ask the questions as to why those checks were not made when we've already been here once before, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to make a clarification, though. The first time that these oaths were changed from the Act from the 1950s to the Act in 2008, that was a significant change for the police in the way those oaths were administered. In fact, you could almost see how that error could have occurred, Mr. Speaker. Of course, no excuse, but you can see what happened there. This time, I think it seems a little more difficult to see how this could have happened. And so I would like to hear the Minister's explanation around that in terms of her ministerial oversight. Mr. Speaker, though, that I do want to say that you get the implication from the fact that we've had 63 police returning to the force to have had this oath administered to them, that perhaps we've got police numbers growing under this minister. That's something that I want to refute up front. And in fact, I will be speaking more on the issue of policing numbers in my next contribution, Mr. Speaker, because this minister has absolutely broken her promises to New Zealand around frontline policing. Absolutely broken her promises. She told the police, indeed she told the country, that we should have a ratio of one officer for every 500 New Zealanders. How many new officers do we have in New Zealand currently since 2009? 52. 52 new frontline police officers. But, Mr. Speaker, I have plenty more to say on the impact that we've had of 52 more officers, but 234 fewer non-sworn staff and support roles for those officers. So functionally, those 53 officers aren't there out on the beat, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely not. They're having to do the duties of the more than 200 non-sworn staff that are no longer serving with the police. But, Mr. Speaker, I have much more to say on that. For now, I'd like to hear what the members on that side of the House to say to explain how the Minister kept her eye off the ball so badly that we could end back here now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Have we finished? I call